欢迎大家来到羊兄咖啡店，就让我来带大家一起去聊时事吧。Hello， 大家好，欢迎大家又回到了羊兄饮茶啦。这期羊兄呢非常有幸能够请到一位政策顾问，也就是 policy consultant 呢，他是目前呢负责提供给政府政策的这个 advice， 还有政府如何实践国家政策还是如何推行国家政策的这位朋友呢真的是非常有幸能够请到他来给我们分享一下对目前时局的看法，还有对政府政策的看法啦。他就是我的好朋友 Idris。
Hey everyone, nice to meet you. Thanks for having me here. Thanks for having me on, bro.
My pleasure, man. So 今天呢 Idris 呢是我在英国 King's College London 所认识的朋友啦，他现在回来真的是前途一片光明啊。好，我们直接进入正题吧，我们来问问看他对当前时局的看法。Okay, bro. So let's start with something more recent about current affairs. So you know that there's a TikTok concert in Penang, right? And it caused a bit of controversies on the ground. People saying that actually it's held 2 days after the one important Muslim occasion in Penang, right? So they asked it to be cancelled altogether or to be moved to other places. Now the result is that it is asked to be moved to Batu Kawan to hold the event. So from your own point of view, do you agree with such move? And do you think that actually the event should be, the location of the event or the timing should be changed to different places instead of the initial planning?
All right, so I think let me just be upfront here about what I think. So first of all, this is very clearly an attempt by opposition members in order to discredit the current political administration in the eyes of its conservative audience. This is something that we've seen happen before. I mean, let me take for example, we have the Coldplay concert that PN also very much criticized the government heavily for and made sure that there was a lot of traffic criticizing the government for its implementation. So I think this is just more of the same. I mean, of course, we've also seen this similarly as well on a wide range of any other issues where the opposition will find any excuse related to entertainment in order to criticize the government. Now, on this note of the 2 days after a religious occasion, I think it's worth noting that just recently this year, the Ministry of Communications and Digital, under its agency Puspal, issued a notice stating that concerts cannot be organized one day. Concerts can only be organized 1 day after such religious occasions.
Correct.
So technically speaking, there's already a government policy which already takes this into account. And I think that policy is very reasonable myself. So I think this whole idea of like 2 days, 1 day, it's really just more politics. I mean, if you want to be so critical about that, right, why not just ask them to push it back to like 1 week, macam tu? And of course, more importantly, why is it that this specific concert, which is really about celebrating local local Southeast Asian artists, is suddenly such an issue?
Right.
So yeah, well, all in all, it's politics. And it's something that the government has already tried to introduce a policy on previously.
But you know that it's the people on the ground, who live in the area that oppose such event, right? So the government now is taking into consideration of their thoughts, and don't you think it is like a right things to do to listen to their opinion right now and to consider even changing the events, the details of the events?
I think for this you have to go back to the idea of the vocal minority, and I think that realistically what I think happened in this case is that yes, there were definitely some people who may have been sensitive, but this was ultimately not something that accounted for everyone in the area. Okay. That's my honest opinion on it.
Okay. Now here comes another issue, right? People have been discussing about this 40 hadis, right? So saying that it might be introduced to national school only within a religious class, right? So but now people in the non-Muslim community have this kind of concern, saying that it might intrude upon non-Muslim space. So what's your take on that?
Okay, so my take on that is when you're looking at this sort of thing, you have to consider that once again, why they were so heavily interested in announcing this 40 hadith is because, once again, it goes back to politics. PN's and PAS's current dynamic and their narrative is that they are trying to push for a certain brand of hyper-conservative Islam in Malaysia. That's been their stance for a very long time. So what we see here from the government in introducing these hadith is an attempt to sort of also help people understand that PAS is not the only one with a monopoly on Islam. That's one. But two, it's also very interesting to note, is that PAS in its very strong traditional heartlands, such as, let's say, Kedah, Kelantan, Terengganu, they have their own brand of religious education as well. And that's where a lot of these youngsters, a lot of Malaysian youth get exposed to their ideals and understanding of Islam, because you also have to understand, for a lot of these Malaysians and Malays from low-income families, that's about as much religious education as they get. So this introducing the 40 hadith, I think, is a step in the right direction by the government. I think while there are certain elements of society who are afraid that perhaps this is going to interfere in, non-Muslim areas. I mean, I'm going to be honest, I know it's not. But what tends to happen here is that a lot of non-Muslims tend to go to Pendidikan Moral. And then Pendidikan Islam, we have our own stream. So it's that Pendidikan Islam stream which the government is trying to shape as well through this introduction.
Right. So it sounds actually government should do more communication work, to actually ensure that non-Muslim communities' concerns are taken into consideration and to explain to them actually this will not affect them. Is that correct?
I think that's absolutely correct, but also in general, there is a need to reform the education system. Actually, no, it's not. There is a need. There has been a need to reform Malaysia's education system for decades already, if I'm being completely honest. So any reform in education, I think for me, is personally very welcome.
So right now, okay, you see, now government have been pushing for a lot of if I can say, conservative agenda, right, to appease conservative Malay votes, correct? So in this election, you can see that Uni government has been trying to get conservative Malay votes to vote for them. So in that regard, didn't you think that pushing for conservative agenda actually can help the government to secure more votes to ensure that they stay in power with a stronger position?
I think if I'm being honest, appealing to conservatives, I think especially from an Islamic perspective, it's helpful, but it's not really what's going to move the needle, in my honest opinion. I think when you look at, for example, states like Kedah, when you look at local government, what people really need at the end of the day isn't education. I mean, it's not reforms of education that they're really looking for. There are certain ideas about the way that a government should look and how a government should act, yes, but what really changes people's lives on the ground is economic reform. Economic reform and addressing important things such as cost of living crisis. That's the most important thing at the end of the day that I think will really push any votes, and that's something that I think I want to see more of from the government, but not in a populist method where I see, for example, they will suddenly increase subsidies for paddy by like almost 200% and to wipe out debts of elder sellers. I mean, yes, I can understand why you would do that, but in the long run, that's not going to be constructive and helpful.
But that's a reality. Votes is everything, correct? So that's why there's a thing called green wave. They are getting a lot of votes from the government. That's why the government is trying to appease conservative Malay votes to ensure that they can convince them to vote for the government. If not, they will lose the votes and lose perhaps the power. So what do you think about that?
Okay, so here's my take on the green wave. Right? The green wave is really more of a counter-reaction to conservative Malay perceptions about BN. They do feel that their interests need to be represented, and that's why they're voting under the PN flag. I mean, yes, PAS is the biggest party at present, but that is only because through that partnership with PN, they're able to advocate for a more moderate tone and to be able to dilute their extreme Islamist image, which has been circulated for a very long time. I think, truth be told. So with regards to the green wave, that is really more of a lot of conservative Malays whose votes previously went to BN, and they shift to PN because they think and they know that BN is very clearly corrupt. I mean, the whole reason why Najib fell back in during the GE14 was because those allegations of corruption were ultimately very damaging, and that has a long-lasting reputation on the perception of UMNO.
So, in your opinion, the reason why green wave is making the wave is because of BN corruption and also the scandals instead of the religious wave in the north, right?
Absolutely correct. I mean, yes, in the north you do have your traditional past strongholds, and those strongholds are always going to be there. But it's what you're really looking at is more about movements in other areas such as Selangor or Penang, for example. Or I mean Kedah, for example. I mean, from one analogy I heard from a Sanusi supporter is that for the first time in a very long time, Kedahans feel represented by Sanusi. And that's really just more about idea. I mean, even then with Sanusi, that's more about ideas of representation, of the image of a strong man, and of course, representation at the state level.
So, in your opinion, in order to secure these votes, is it just the government just have to do some economic reform and to get economic things on the ground going to secure their votes, or is there any other thing that the government should do to secure their votes, the conservative Malay votes?
So I think economic reforms is definitely the most important. I think that from an image perspective, they can really only do so much. I mean, let's be honest about what the government is now. It's a marriage of convenience.
Yes.
BN and PH, they have been enemies. They are enemies. They are only working together because that is the numbers needed to form the government. And I think when the results for GE15 also came out for the first time, I was very surprised as well, personally. I think because that's the first time that I've seen the conservative Malay vote gridlocked in such a manner where it basically compromises had to be made. And I think, truth be told, this was a step in the right direction, I think, this current unity coalition, because you're only going to get so far with the conservative Malay vote, which honestly represents a significant majority of Malaysia.
Right. But the problem people have been saying that because of this election, and you know the results, right? The unity formulas seems not to be working in a lot of areas, especially in the north. And the government, even in Negeri Sembilan, they can only win the seat by a very narrow margin. So do you think this formula is going to get them forward again in the next election?
I think that ultimately really depends on what the policies are that the government introduces. That's going to be, the next 4 years are going to be key for the government to win back the confidence of the people. That's first and foremost important. You have to also remember, we have been through a severe time of political instability over the past few years, which has been incited by the COVID-19 pandemic and of course Sheraton move as well. So economic reforms and policies are going to be the most important step moving forward, because that's ultimately what Malaysians want. Malaysians from all religions and races want economic reform.
So including conservative Malay?
Including conservative Malays as well. I mean, even then, the thing you also have to remember, going back to the idea of the vocal minority, a lot of these issues are being played up by certain elements because they benefit off that. They gain political capital, and as we've seen with the Green Wave, they gain certain political stability. However, I think it's the responsibility of the government now in order to ensure that they offer what is ultimately a more constructive and suitable economic package for Malaysians as a whole.
Okay. So right now, let's talk about the opposition as well. You know that opposition members in this election have been playing the race and religion cards to secure the votes, and that's why we have this thing called the Green Wave, right? So, do you think do you agree with the mixing religion with politics in Malaysia, and do you think this is a acceptable approach to politics?
I think, bluntly speaking, no. I personally am not a big fan of the idea of mixing race and religion into politics. I have always been an advocate for the idea that politics should be more policy-based. That we should it should be more about policies and the benefits they provide, rather than just purely focusing on attacks and using religion and race issues in order to build your political influence.
But the thing is that they have a huge support in that, right? And you can't stop them from doing so. So what can we do actually to counter that?
I think when it comes to countering, it's a matter of stabilization and acceptance, but it's also about moving the needle very slowly. I think, for example, when I spoke to someone from PN who was campaigning in Selangor, a lot of the issues that they focused on were not actually race or religion. It was cost of living. It was governance issues. That's where the conversation has to be hit. I mean, of course, this was at the state and local government level, but I think that's where we should be focusing on. And, realistically, the reason why it's so hard for us to jump out of that race and religion model is because, truthfully speaking, we have been using that for many years. That has been the talking points that have been used for many years. It is not going to be an overnight transition in order to be able to transition into a post-BN dominant political environment. That's not going to be a simple transition. It was never going to be a simple transition, in my opinion.
So what can they do actually to be so-called the constructive opposition?
I mean, when it comes to constructive opposition, it's really about focusing on the things that really matter. I mean, for example, we should be supporting, or at least help understanding the opposition when they come and attack the government from more important things, such as food security, for example. I think food security, states' rights, these are issues which I think would be better for the opposition to criticize the current government on.
But you know that they have not been doing this, right? Including in the states where they govern. So in that accent, in that regard, right, we can't really see the emergence of a constructive opposition. So in that regard, do you think the third force, for example, Muda, can actually play the role of becoming a constructive oppositions for the government?
I think, truth be told, when you're talking about third forces, technically there have been third forces that have been existent in Malaysia for some period of time. Okay. This would be such as Party Socialist Malaysia and other independent candidates. And at this current point in time, MUDA has not built up its grassroots network sufficiently to be able to really become a third force per se. Okay. They still have a very long way to go in order to be able to establish a credible voter base. What MUDA can do in order to become that third force, perhaps, I think, in over a period of about 10-15 years, perhaps what we can see is that as the current Madani administration will shift to perhaps a more moderate or center-right approach in its policies and how it appeals to how it appeals to Malaysian voters, what we could see in time, if MUDA is able to organize and is able to conduct sufficient grassroots engagement, is that MUDA can then capture those votes on the left and on the center left.
So coming to the last part of the interview, how do you see our politics moving forward in the next maybe 5 years, 5 to 10 years?
I think for the next 5 years, it will probably be more of the same. You will see some political elements attempt to use certain policies, but I think as time goes on and things become more stable, because you have to remember, politically speaking, at this point in time, Malaysia has only just exited a period of severe political instability. Things are going to seem unstable, things are going to be tense for a period of time, but once eventually the political battle lines are stabilized, once PH and BN are able to get their houses in order, and once we see that relationship begin to solidify, we could then see perhaps a movement towards a more progressive discussion in politics where things are focused on more policy issues. I mean, that's ultimately what I would prefer for the future of my country, where discussions are more about things like states' rights, where things are more focused about discussions on are we doing enough on certain issues such as food security or digital economy or equity, rather than it being focused purely on race and religion.
Honestly speaking, do you think that is going to happen?
It's going to take a very long time. As I said before, Malaysia is in a transitionary period.
Okay, thank you so much, Idris. Thank you so much for your time. I'm sure that our audience benefit a lot from your insight, and thank you for joining the interview.
No worries, bro.
好的，各位，今天呢非常谢谢 Idris 来到我们的节目，然后他也分享了很多关于他对马来西亚当前时局的想法，当然还有政治的想法啦。我也希望大家呢能够受惠良多。不知道大家对于他分享的这些意见又有什么看法呢？欢迎大家在下面留言发表你的看法哦。这期的杨兄聊时事呢，不是杨兄杨茶呢，节目来到尾声。如果你是喜欢这内容访谈的朋友呢，请不要吝啬订阅、点赞，还有分享出去，因为你们的支持是对我最大的鼓励哦。然后 Idris, thank you so much once again.
No worries, bro. All good. And thank you all for watching, and hope you guys enjoyed my insights.
Right. 谢谢 Idris. 我祝大家身体健康，我们再会。拜拜。